So today we're going to look at creating an Excel macro that will export a sheet or a range of data from one workbook into another. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new workbook so we can create some data to export. So we're going to do this into a new macro workbook. So in versions 2019, you will see this as Excel macro enabled workbook. In previous versions of Excel, you may see this as .xlsm. It is the same thing. If you do not use this format to save your file, you will not be able to save the code that you write in VBA with the workbook. So you'll lose that. So you need to make sure you do this. So I do this up front. That way I can save the workbook as I go. I'll show you one of the tricks I do with that, and then I don't lose anything. So here we have some data. So this is the data that we're going to want to export into a new workbook. So the first thing we're going to want to do is go into the VBA code window and start to write the code. So I can either do this to the developer tab and then Visual Basic, or you can use a shortcut, which is Alt F11. So I always write mine into a new module. I don't put my code in the sheet in case the sheet gets deleted, or if I want to do something else with the sheet, the code would be with the sheet. If it's with the module, it doesn't matter what happens with the sheet. The code will still be there. So for now, we can call this whatever we want. So I'm just going to call this sub a go now. The first thing that I do at the start of every new macro or code or sub procedure, whatever you want to call this, is to save this. So that way, every time I run my code, the workbook saves. And that's important because sometimes you write some code, maybe you write a loop statement and you forget to exit the loop, or you have a mistake in it, and the only thing you can do is bomb out of that entire workbook. If you haven't saved it in a while, you're going to lose all the code that you wrote. So by doing this, often with code, you run it over and over and over again as you're doing little adjustments. That way you don't lose anything in case you do end up having to bomb out of your workbook or something happens where you lose your workbook. Sometimes though, it is, like I said, nice to put it into a nice bright color like pink, and then it can really stand out. You'll find that this is really useful. There's always a recommendation that when you're writing code, especially code that will be taken over by somebody else potentially one day, that all of your code has comments in it. A lot of people think of macros as just something you throw together, but it's important to remember that you should follow the same rules as if you're a real developer. And many people who develop macros may not be quote unquote real developers, but it is important to follow the same rules as you would see as any other application would be. These macros often are very important. They're very critical in a business process. And it's important that they are able to be maintained beyond the life of that you may have with this macro, that you may have with this file. So I've set my variables. So this is the variable WB. I've set this, you can set this anything you want. I've just chosen WB. And this right here is actually going to create the first workbook. So the actual workbook that we're going to copy to. So I'm going to put in here, create workbook. The next thing I'm going to do is add code to actually move the data over from this sheet into the next sheet, into the next workbook. For these purposes, I'm going to move it from sheet 1 in here to sheet 2 in here. One thing that's important is, even though I'm saying sheet 1 and by default this is actually called sheet, the word 1, in the code you can either refer to it by its name, sheet 1, or you can refer to it by its place, which is the number 1. So there are multiple ways for you to write this code. I'm going to do a quick and simple and very stable way to do this. I could actually use the copy function and actually put this into the clipboard and then paste it into the new file. I don't want to do that because if you're doing this multiple times, it consumes your clipboard. And if you're running this macro and then doing something else in another Word document, email, something like that, and you go to paste or copy, it's going to add that to the clipboard and mess up your code. So again, if this was just a one-time thing, it would work, but we're going to do this a little bit differently. So here we have the code written for what is going to be copied over from one workbook, the existing workbook, to the new one. So again, I've set my new workbook up. This is going to open a new workbook. We're going to step through this and watch this. And then in the new workbook, in the first sheet, which will be called sheet 1, we're going to put in this range, we're going to put whatever is in the same range in this existing workbook. So I went all the way to F. Theoretically or correctly, it should be E, and I can just change that here. Obviously, sometimes you don't know where your data is. It may not be fixed. Columns are often fixed. You get the same formatted data every single time, but you may have 10 rows, 100 rows, 50 rows. There are different ways to figure that out, but for now, we're just going to show you a real quick and easy way to get this data from the main workbook into the new workbook. And then we'll also show you how to save that new workbook. So let's step through this. So again, I've saved my code. That way, if something happens, I'm safe. You can see in the background, book 3 has created, so that's the new workbook. And then we have set up sheet 1 in that new workbook to have the same data. So let's just do a quick formatting. So here we've written code to auto fit the columns, columns A through E, and we will automatically resize those. So if I drag that up and I press F8 just to step down one line of code, you can see those are now the columns are automatically the correct width. Let's do one other thing here. So this code will set the columns, set the rows, row 1 to be bold font. So I drag that up, I press F8, and that has now made those bold. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to save this workbook. So we're going to save this in, so for this purposes, we're going to save this in the same path that the main workbook is in. So if I do this workbook.path, this will give me the path of the current workbook, and then I'm going to do an and. I'm going to add the backslash, and then I'm going to call this workbook to test.xlx. And this will save this in this path. So if I hover over this, or if I add this to the watch, you can see that the location, you can see it's C2./users administration /desktop. There's no backslash at the end of it. That's why I've had to add that there. And then I'm just going to call this workbook to test.xlx. So that is now saved. You can see at the top that's now saved. If we wanted to close this, we could. So we would do wp.close to close that workbook. We would then be back in our main workbook. And then the last thing we want to do is, for this purpose, this is not important, but for if you had more code to write after this, if you were doing additional things, we want to clear the setting for WB. So anytime you set something, you want to set it back to nothing. So this will essentially clear what that has in storage for that. So if you accidentally refer to it later, or if you reuse this variable, it won't be pulling up that what was already in there. So that's always a good tip. And then the last thing we want to do after setting that to nothing is just have a little message box that pops up to say that it's done. So a really simple message box. So again, this is just a very easy and quick way to export data from one workbook into another. There are multiple ways to do this. Copy and paste is definitely one of them, but that does have its issues. Even this can have its issues. If it's a very large data set, this sometimes can get bogged down and there can be issues. Moving this much data, it can say, run out of system resources. So there is no perfect way to do this, but this is just one of the methods. There are actually other methods beyond this, but for many